So what I want to do now is talk about each of those three perspectives and try to cultivate an appreciation for each of the three. You may find yourself identifying with one more than another, but my goal here is to help foster an appreciation of all three. So we'll start by looking at the traditional perspective. The traditional perspective has been around for a long time. By my reckoning, it dates to about 6,000 years ago. The traditional perspective, I'm connecting in time to within a couple of thousand years of when the plow was invented, when agriculture and agrarian societies first became populous, when cities and towns grew up. Some people would date the traditional era even further back in time, to the beginning of cultivation, which might have been another 6,000 years in the past. I'm seeing there's some colors missing on the screen that will make it a little tougher to follow, but we'll make do with that. The traditional perspective is time-honored. It lasts, prevails today, not prevails, but it still is evident in culture today. Some of the evidence of it is the traditional religions that originated in the traditional era, mostly about 2,000 or so years ago. Patriotic nationalism goes along with the traditional era. The military culture comes from the traditional era. All of these things last into today, but originated a very long time ago. There are many leaders in recent history who exemplify a traditional perspective. Churchill and Pope John Paul represent two of them. That is, much of what they said comes from a traditional perspective. Typical organizational structures from the traditional era include a lot of forms of hierarchy, hierarchical authority. Think of traditional church structures where authority flows down from above. That originated with the traditional era. Feudalism, dictatorship, bureaucracy are all inventions of that traditional era. Now, some of the innovations and enduring values that we might be able to celebrate. Faith, duty, law and order, self-sacrifice for a higher cause, all of these things, preservation of tradition, all of these values originate in that traditional era as well. These are things that whether you consider yourself traditional or not, whether you consider your politics to be based on traditional values, you can probably celebrate these values. And right there is a set of ponies. But, lest you think I'm going to ignore the parts of the perspectives that you may not be fond of, we're going to look at that too. What we want to look at in integral perspective is the excesses and the pathological expressions of each perspective. They've all got them, and by going over these, I'm hoping I might be able to offend everybody in the room by the time I'm done. But we'll see. We'll see. The excesses of the traditional perspective, when taken to an extreme, the traditional perspective can lead to rigid intolerance, absolutely rigid intolerance, dependence on dogma. That is, ideologies become things of themselves. They become the ends of themselves. They're not open to critical examination. So dogmatic approach is an excess of the traditional perspective. Most of the fundamentalist religious folks we see on the planet today are coming from a traditional perspective. It might be one religion or another. Every religion has their fundamentalists, but it tends to be the traditional perspective tends to produce literalism and fundamentalism, and chauvinism of various kinds, not just gender-related, but all sorts of chauvinism, elevating one's own group above others. Modern era, I'm dating it to about 400 years ago. Some people date the modern era to 1611, when Galileo looked through his telescope and observed four of what were then thought to be stars. And he said, now, wait a minute, sometimes they're passing in front of Jupiter, and sometimes they appear to be blocked by Jupiter. So they must be revolving around Jupiter. Well, in the traditional era, it was thought, actually since Aristotle, it was thought that all knowledge could be derived from basic principles. That is, there was no need to observe nature. And so it was heretical often to observe nature and make observations that contradicted church dogma. So So Galileo, again, church dogma said, this is church dogma, we're not talking about science in those days. Church dogma, deduced from principles of faith, said that a heavier object falls faster than a lighter object. So Galileo climbed the Tower of Pisa, dropped a heavy weight and a light weight, and timed it, and observed that no, it's not true, that all objects accelerate at the same speed. A feather drops lighter because of air resistance, but all objects drop at the same speed. So the idea was that what was new here, what introduced the modern era, were folks like Galileo, who were beginning to observe nature for themselves and challenge the dogma of the traditional era. The modern era is going strong today. Science and technology are the most prominent products of the modern era. Mainstream media, professional sports, the idea of professionalism at all, corporate structures, corporate culture, all coming from the modern era. I'm doing a very superficial treatment of these perspectives, by the way. You could spend careers studying any one of these and comparing them. All I'm trying to do here is give you a flavor of them and a basis for appreciation of all of them. Exemplary leaders of the modern era, Kennedy and Sagan. Science and politics. Typical structures in the modern era include corporations, democratic capitalism grew up in the modern era. In fact, all of democracy did. Again, the idea, prior to the modern era, the individual was subsumed in the collective. There was a static view of the world. Heaven, royalty, and earth and its peasants. There was no sense, no view such as we have today that an individual can observe and form opinions of their own. So individualism itself arose in the modern era, and that gave rise to democracy on a large scale. Innovations of the modern era, science and technology, valuing progress, achievement, valuing meritocracy or individual merit. The middle class rose up as a result of the modern era. And now the excesses of the modern era are probably well known to all of you. The modern era tends to be nihilistic, that is, it strips meaning out of things. And so many folks view modernism, the modern perspective, as stripping the world of all that is sacred, which leaves you with no place to stand by some people's accounts. The modern era, modernism tends to be materialistic, and I mean materialistic in the sense of a belief in materialism, which is a belief basically that the only stuff that's real is matter and energy. And so hope and love and fear are not real, they're just sort of epiphenomena. They arise from matter, but they're in a sense illusory. Modern era is infamous for its colonializing, for its imperialism, for its exploitation. Those are the excesses of the modern era. Now compare modern and traditional. A couple of things to observe that are going to be common characteristics in integral theory, common properties we want to know. When a new layer, a new perspective emerges, earlier forms remain. Modernism did not replace or destroy traditional perspectives. Both perspectives are strong today. So the earlier forms remain. The later forms build on earlier forms. So to a significant degree, modernism was a response to traditionalism. The church